Hello, I'm Chris from Eurogamer, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce today's first session, which is it's going to have Andre Arsenault from the Creative Assembly. He's the lead battle AI designer for Total War Warhammer, and he's going to talk about how they've kind of improved the siege AI with this game, specifically things like how you make sieges work when you've got giants and like flying units. So that should be fun. There's no Q&A at the end of this session, but it's worth sticking around till the end because there's going to be some brand new gameplay. So yeah, without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Andre.
Thanks. Hello, everybody. As Chris said, my name is Andre Arsenault, and I'm the lead battle AI programmer for Creative Assembly on the Total War series. So today we are going to talk about the Siege Battle AI. All right, so before we get into that, let me tell you, for those of you who may not be familiar with Total War, a little bit of summary here. So Total War is an award-winning strategy series with about 15 years of history. We just celebrated our 15-year anniversary recently. It's set in various historical time periods, from the Japanese shogunate all the way up to the Napoleonic Empire. And it features a sandbox-style, turn-based campaign map with real-time battles. And all the resource management and recruiting is done on the campaign, so it's not your typical RTS. And when I talk about battle AI, I mean the AI in those real-time battles, not in the campaign. So during the battles, you control armies of thousands of men in order to defeat the AI. And we have various battle types throughout the series, including open field land battles, ambushes, river crossings, and siege battles. And this talk focuses exclusively on the siege battles. Total War Warhammer brings the gameplay style of Total War together with the amazing world of the Warhammer fantasy battles. It's the first non-historical setting for the Total War series, and as such it presents a bunch of new challenges to the battle AI, such as having new unit types like individual hero units, flying units and mechanical stuff, mechanical contraptions. There's very different unit rosters per faction in this game. For example, the dwarves don't have cavalry at all, and the vampire counts don't have any missile units. And there's also a very wide range of unit power, capabilities, and upgrades available through the campaign map that influence the units in battle. And of course, there's a dramatic new spells system that brings a crazy new element to the battles themselves. So there's a lot for the AI to deal with that we didn't have to deal with before. This talk itself, we're going to go quickly through the context of siege battles in Total War Warhammer. We're going to talk about, it's quite a technical talk, so we're going to dive into the AI architecture that's used in Total War in general for all of the battles. And then we're going to cover some level-specific design hints that our designers place on the map in order to tell the AI how to use the map. And then we're going to dive into the details of the attacking siege AI. We're not going to talk too much about defending, just so that we can focus and get into the real nitty-gritty of how the AI works when it's attacking. And then we're going to get to see some of that new gameplay footage that Chris mentioned with the AI in action, laying siege to an enemy city. And you'll get to see it all come together. And then finally, we'll end up with a summary of the highlights. So let's dive in and talk about siege battles. So siege battles are major battles over a well-defended, walled city. It shows off the biggest and coolest cities of each faction, and they're intended to be a high-stakes battle that has a significant strategic impact on the campaign. They're triggered when an army attacks the capital of a province on the campaign map. The defenders can hold out for several turns before suffering losses due to attrition, and during that time, the attacker can build siege equipment, which takes at least one turn to complete. And when the attacker starts the battle, they bring that siege equipment into battle with them, but they can't lug it around the campaign map with their army. So within a siege battle, there's always an attacker and a defender. The attacking army brings the army that's laying siege to the map, including any siege equipment that they chose to build before they initiated the battle. The defender always has some free garrison units, and the type and amount of which is dependent on how much you've upgraded your settlement on the campaign. And the defender might also have a separate army of units that was stationed in the city before it was besieged. Additionally, each side can bring multiple armies worth of reinforcements, depending on how the armies are positioned on the campaign map. If you have an additional army close enough to the city, then they'll get pulled into the battle as well. The attacker always deploys its armies on the field outside of the city walls, and the defender deploys either on the walls or inside the city itself. And the attacker always deploys first without knowing where the units of the defender are positioned, which has some interesting implications for the AI. In general, the battle is won when the enemy armies have been defeated, or the attacker manages to capture the victory point at the center of the map, and every siege battle has a victory point. So, our goals for Warhammer's siege battles have changed significantly from what they were in previous historical goals. In those previous games, we were shooting for historical authenticity, of course. We wanted the attacking player to be able to physically surround the city on all sides and have a deliberate, again, historically authentic bombardment phase where you would do a lot of damage to the city before you even started moving your troops within range of the enemy. And then once you got past those city walls, we wanted an intricate street battle to fight so you could defend the plaza, defend the streets, and various choke points in order to prevent the attacker from getting at your victory point. And in Rome 2 and Attila, those goals were executed by the attacking siege AI by using a single tactic that had one finite state machine that controlled the entire army. Our goals for Warhammer are slightly different, though. We wanted fast, high-intensity battles as opposed to deliberate phases. We wanted a single attack direction as opposed to surrounding the city, which focuses the battle on the city walls and makes them very important, because you can't really feint that much and come around from the rear. Holding those walls should be the key to defending the city, and if they make it past the walls, then the battle is going to quickly be over one way or the other. So for the attacking AI, pressing the defender quickly and broadly across the walls is very important. Because of these different gameplay goals, the AI had to attack the city in a very different way. So we had a solid foundation to build on from Total War Attila, but significant effort still had to be spent to reorganize that functionality in order to accomplish these new gameplay goals. And we did this by taking that single tactic and splitting it up into its component pieces and building multiple tactics that can then execute simultaneously instead of one phase at a time. Most of what I'm going to talk about today is a result of that reorganization process. So before we can get into the details of how the attacking siege tactics work, we have to talk a bit about the battle AI in general and its architecture. So there's many tiers of game objects in the battle hierarchy. Starting with the smallest, we have an entity, which represents a single man or a composite entity like a horse and its rider. Then we move up to a squad, which is a collection of entities. Units, which are collections of squads, typically of 80 to 120 entities in a unit. Armies, which are collections of units, generally up to 20 units in an army. And then alliances, which are collections of armies. Orders, just like for a player, are always issued to units, and the AI uses the exact same set of orders that players issue. For example, move to that location, or change your width, pick up that piece of siege equipment, activate that ability, etc. So effectively, the battle AI is game logic that acts the same way that a player does by executing the same set of orders. So in order to see how that's accomplished, we should look at the architecture of the battle AI. This architecture has been established in Total War for a number of years. It's well proven, and it uses a set of top-down layers going from the high-level strategy layer down to the individual tactics. We call it the Objective Detachment Tactic System. And there isn't any individual unit AI in this system at all, actually. The individual unit orders are only executed after considering what everything else on the field is up to. So starting at the top, we have the Alliance, which we've already mentioned briefly. the alliance in the battle, every alliance in the battle is capable of running the AI. That's useful if you have a reinforcing army that enters on the player's side that's being played by the AI, so you have a player and an AI on the same alliance, or if the player wants to place some of his units under simplified AI control. Then we have a system that we call the Grand Tactical Analyzer, which is the top level of the AI itself. It decides whether the entire alliance should be attacking or defending, depending on battlefield circumstances. Below that, we have objectives, and those objectives represent a set of units that's matched to a high-level AI goal. Then we have detachments, and a detachment is responsible for figuring out how to accomplish the goal. In practice, each objective has one detachment. Detachments have a set of tactics they can choose from in order to go about accomplishing the goal. And those tactics can be reused between multiple detachments, so they can be fairly agnostic, like attack or defend or outflank, and they can be used by different detachments to accomplish different goals. The tactics themselves represent a maneuver, such as advancing in formation, outflanking, or holding a position, and their goal is generally to get the assigned units to that tactic into an engagement distance with the enemy where the melee manager takes over. And the melee manager is responsible for the micromanagement of individual AI units, but still considering the context of everything else that's going on in the battle. So it's the one that issues individual attack orders. The tactics actually don't do that. And all of those systems are owned and processed by the battle model. And we say model in terms of the typical model view controller architecture, if you're familiar with programming. The model itself is completely deterministic for networking requirements and for replays, which are pretty awesome, that we use replays a lot during development to reproduce bugs and share them between each other. So moving on to the details of the CJI specifically, there's a single objective detachment pair for attacking and a different objective detachment pair for defending. We can hold a lot of state in those detachments because the Grand Tactical Analyzer, in this case, keeps those objectives and detachments alive for the whole battle because we know that's not going to change. The battle will always be a siege battle. It's never going to flop. So we have specific tactics for attacking and defending. The ones highlighted in red are the ones that we're going to talk about during this session, and the tasks and tactics in white in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide are controlled by a specialized subsystem called the Settlement AI, and that deals exclusively with the interior of the city and moving guys around through the streets through various settlement graphs and influence maps. And we'll take a quick peek at how that works, but we're not going to dive too much into it due to time constraints. So before we can get into the details of those tactics that were highlighted in red, we should talk about some of the hints that designers have to place on the maps in order for the AI to work in siege battles. So obviously this is a placeholder screenshot. It's totally from a dev build, not representative at all of the actual game, but it works really well to show these hints. And the first one here is the settlement perimeter. So it's a closed polygon that's drawn by hand by a designer, and it defines which parts of the map are considered inside the city. It doesn't have to be totally perfect, but there should be no part of the city that is not included by the polygon, including the city walls. And then we have deployment lines. These are placed by the designers that indicate locations where the AI could choose to deploy a portion of its forces at the start of the battle. The width doesn't matter, just its position and orientation. And then from there, we draw a line forward when the map loads to determine an assault designation. And that line goes from the deployment line to the fort perimeter. And that essentially indicates to the AI a channel or a lane that the AI can use to focus some of its forces on a portion of the city wall. At that point where the assault designation contacts the fort perimeter, we have an attack focus. And that's the point where the AI is actually going to focus its attacks. So when it's examining which parts of the wall it should choose to dock a tower on, it's looking for pieces of the walls that are close to that attack focus. So each assault designation gets a score generated from 0 to 1 based on each type of entry method available to the AI. So for walls, how many dockable walls are there near the attack focus? For gates, how close is the nearest gate to that attack focus? And for breaching walls, how many destroyable wall sections are close to that attack focus? And those scores are first calculated when the map loads, then they get recalculated as the battle progresses as well. So within the city itself, we have a settlement graph, which is a set of nodes and edges that are used to define the AI's usable space within the city and the relationship between them. So it's used for navigation and spatial awareness. It's manually drawn by a designer, but it can also be dynamically modified at runtime as if parts of the city walls have been destroyed and there's a new entry point available. The shape of that settlement graph also defines the shape of corresponding influence maps that the AI uses to perform tactical spatial reasoning within the city. So there's separate influence graphs for values such as threat, the strategic value for capturing an area, which is what's shown here. So the capture point is in red. Well, the further you go from that victory point, the less important it is to capture that area. There's a separate one for the strategic value of defending an area, another one for each area's exposure to missile fire, and 2 more for friendly occupation strength and enemy occupation strength. We can use those in concert to determine how and where the AI should attack and defend within the city itself. So on previous titles, every siege map was handcrafted, and due to their complexity, they were actually a common source of AI behavior issues. So we have a new prefab system for Warhammer, which allows us to reuse logical layouts and therefore reuse the AI hints and settlement graphs across multiple maps, but still give each map a dramatically different look and feel between factions, as you can see here. The quality of that settlement graph authoring has a huge impact on the AI's performance within the settlement, and so one of the major benefits of us switching to this prefab system for city building was that we get to author fewer settlement graphs, which gives us better testing coverage and therefore higher quality AI behavior. In Warhammer, we have many logical layouts per faction. So you'll see at least a dozen different shapes of cities that look totally different for each faction. So now let's dive into the specifics of the CJI's strategy and tactics. The strategy for attacking a walled city is pretty simple. Step 1, get past the walls. Step 2, take the victory point, right? Obvious. But executing that strategy is not so simple. Step 1 is carried out with a set of specific special purpose tactics. And step 2 is carried out by that highly specialized subsystem called the settlement AI. So that system controls all units within the city walls, whereas the tactics control all the units outside the city walls. So the goal of each tactic in the first step is actually to create entry points into the city through which we can send our units in order to hand them off to the second step. Note that that means that since units get handed off as soon as they reach the settlement graph, both of these steps have to actually be executing at the same time. So you'll have some of your units outside and some of your units inside. So how do we actually get into the city? Well, we have a few options. We can either destroy the walls, generally by shooting it with artillery. We can climb over the walls using siege towers, which are great, or placing some ladders, which are another option with its own pros and cons. We could destroy the gates and go through that way. So there's a lot of options for going through the gates, some of which are more appropriate than others, but destroying the gate is always possible. It's a true fallback because the battle AI won't ever withdraw, and that's a gameplay decision that we've made and has been true for a few games now. So there always has to be something for the AI to do to try to get into the city, even if you destroy all of its artillery, take out all of its siege towers. It needs a fallback, and that fallback is destroying the gates. So I mentioned that the goal of the tactics is to create entry points into the city. Well, entry points are an actual game object that represent an available entry method. So that's either an entry method that is currently available or one that is an attempt in progress. So each entry point has an estimated time to completion, a progress percentage, and a fulfillment score, which roughly corresponds to the number of units that are assigned to that entry point. Internally, that entry point also holds a pointer to the tactic that's currently responsible for that entry point. Those entry points can actually be created through player actions as well, meaning that if an attacking player creates a way to climb the walls, the friendly AI reinforcements will know about it and can actually exploit it. So in order to determine which tactics we should employ to get past the walls, we have to organize the available units in the attacking armies into specialized groups. And that process occurs during deployment. The attacker always deploys first, so we don't have any information about how the defender is deploying its forces on the walls when we make these decisions. We first have to identify the available units from the army which can lead each type of tactic and form hypothetical groups around them with supporting units. This gives us a set of ideal units, and a set of ideal groups from the main attacking army. And we then match those ideal groups with the AI hints that were placed on the map. And finally, we send any groups that were not able to be matched with the hints to the reserves, along with any remaining ungrouped units. And so that gives us a set of attacking tactics starting in deployment. Now that those are in place, we can talk a bit more detail about some of those attacking tactics. Let's start with the gate assault tactic. The goal of this tactic is to destroy a specific gate so that we can get into the city. That functionality was extracted from the single tactic that used to be used to control the whole army in the historical games and is turned into a standalone tactic in its own right. So given an assault designation to use, which is that lane of how do we attack the city, which direction, the gate assault tactic identifies the gate by choosing the closest one to the attack focus. So in order to destroy the gate, we can use a number of tools. The first is battering rams. Those are awesome. They're totally the right tool for the job, but they have to be manned by an infantry unit, and they have to be built before the battle on the campaign map. So you might not have them. We could also use something new to Warhammer, which is monstrous creatures. Some factions have monstrous creatures that are really well suited to bashing stuff. But that's not necessarily to say that all monstrous creatures are particularly good at destroying the gates. So we need to take a quick detour here and discuss that in a bit more detail. So what is this unit? What is it? How should I use it? In historical games, unit classification was pretty straightforward. Had sword infantry, spearmen, missile infantry, cavalry, artillery, your staples, right? So that was really clear, and as a result, the AI actually started making decisions, behavioral decisions, based on the type of unit. But in Warhammer, we've got all of that stuff, plus we have flying units, war machines, monstrous creatures like giants, trolls, and spiders, and individual heroic characters. And at first, those might just seem like new categories, but the units within those categories have really different strengths and weaknesses. So we can't really make decisions based on the fact that it's a hero, because one hero is completely different from another. So we have to have a better way of describing a unit's role on the battlefield. So we introduced a new system to answer the question of not what the unit is, but how the AI should use it. So, for example, is it excellent in melee, or should it try to avoid melee combat? Or maybe it excels at flanking, or maybe it's really good at bashing down gates, or it could potentially be a high-value unit that's worth protecting even at the cost of sacrificing something else. So a unit can have more than one use, so we created a set of AI usage flags that designers can place on the unit records that helps the AI understand how to use that unit properly. And those flags are combined into a bit field structure. So getting back to the gate assault tactic, we can now examine a unit's AI usage flags to determine whether or not it's a gate crusher instead of checking if it's a monstrous creature. And that makes a lot more sense, and it's a lot more generic and versatile. And then finally, bashing the gates is the ultimate fallback, right? So if there aren't any other options for the AI, that's what they're going to do. So any unit can just attack the gates in melee. So how does the tactic itself actually work? Well, it follows this kind of simple flow chart. First, we form up into formation, ensuring that the best units for destroying the gates are placed at the front and center of that formation. Then we advance towards the target gate as a group. Then once we arrive at a staging position, we choose the best unit from that group that is well suited to destroying the gate. And to make that decision, since we may have multiple gate crushers or no gate crushers, we perform a time to destruction calculation for each unit in the tactic, which factors in the time for the unit to reach the gate, and then the time it would take for that unit to destroy the gate once it's reached it, by doing an estimate of their DPS versus buildings, which we perform at runtime. And then while we have a unit attacking the gate, if possible, we can periodically relinquish a unit to climb the walls and attack any defenders who are up there shooting at us. Or if we're lucky, we might actually be able to get over the walls and capture the gate from the inside instead of waiting for it to be destroyed. And then if our main attacking unit gets invalidated somehow, such as being forced to rout or hit by a major spell, something unexpected, then we'll just choose the next best attacking unit and send it forth. We continue trying to destroy that gate since it's our method of last resort. And we use the supporting units who are kind of waiting nearby, ready to pounce once the gate is destroyed, to try to protect that main unit as it's doing its attack. So once we capture or destroy that gate, we record it as an accessible entry point to the settlement, and then the tactic is complete. Let's look at the wall assault tactic. The goal here is to create a way for our unmounted units to be able to scale the walls. This functionality was also extracted from that single tactic in the historical games that used to control the whole army. So given a specific assault designation to use, the wall assault tactic identifies a set of allowable wall targets by scanning the walls that are close to the attack focus. So once we've chosen a target, we go about executing the tactic by choosing which units we can use in order to accomplish the goal. We can have some siege towers, which are the specific tool for the job. They're really well suited. They offer excellent protection from missile fire for the unit that's in the siege tower as it approaches the walls. But the downside is that it has to be built from the campaign view while sieging the map, so you may not have them. And then we could also use ladders. So any infantry unit can raise ladders and scale the walls. However, they don't have any protection during the approach, and they incur fatigue penalties while climbing, leaving them less fit for combat. And you'll see that in the gameplay video a little later on, the difference in effectiveness between the two. It's still a great choice to use ladders, but you have to be a little bit more careful about when and why. So of course, only certain unit types can climb siege towers and ladders. So while it's a great tactic to employ, it doesn't work for all of your units, such as cavalry and vehicles. They won't be able to exploit these entry points. The way that this tactic actually works is at first, we do something a little different. We form groups within the tactic that consist of one unit that has a siege tower equipped, or a unit that we intend to place ladders. And then we form supporting units around that unit to protect the leader and potentially return fire to defenders who are on the walls. Then each of those groups advances towards the city walls independently, and they choose their own separate wall piece to dock with. That wall target is selected, and then it goes through a verification process through the tactic itself to ensure that the groups don't cross paths as they advance towards the walls. And then once they reach the target wall piece, they dock the tower or place the ladder, and that is at the point where the tactic is then complete because it has successfully created an entry point. And finally, let's talk briefly about the wall breach tactic. So here, the goal is obviously to destroy the walls. So we choose a target near the attack focus. We use missile units to perform this that are strong enough to actually destroy buildings. And at first, we just form up into a group. We put any direct fire missile units that have a low fire trajectory in the front and center of that formation, and then the indirect fire units, such as catapults, can go in the rear, and then protected by melee or missile troops on the sides. They form up into a formation, They advance towards the target. Once all of the intended missile units are in range, they focus fire down that one specific wall target, and once it's been destroyed, we mark the entry point as complete, and the tactic is done. So that gives us a set of entry points in order to get into the city. But we only know about the entry points that the AI has created at this point. We have to also solve the problem of an AI acting as a reinforcement for a player army. So briefly, we go back to the architecture diagram, slightly zoomed in view, and we have to add a new element called the entry point manager, which is owned by the Grand Tactical Analyzer. That entry point the entry point manager is responsible for not only holding the set of entry points that were created by the AI, but also for scanning the city walls, looking for additional entry points that it doesn't know about. And any such entry points have obviously been created through player action or other game mechanics, and the AI should know about it. So once it finds a new entry point, it creates a representation that says, this is immediately accessible, it's of type, docked wall tower, or something like that. And then the rest of the tactics are able to use it correctly. So now we're ready to storm the city. That entry point tactic, the storm entry points tactic, is responsible for sending units into the city through the entry points. So we have a nice split of responsibilities here, where the assault tactics are creating the entry points, and this storm entry point tactic uses them. We do this by forming groups for each entry point, and it's okay to have an empty group because we can assign more units to it later. And then those groups send their units through the entry point in a way that makes sense for that type of entry point. So it'll issue the appropriate orders to either climb a tower or just run through the wall breach. So in previous, like I mentioned, this is new to Warhammer, so that functionality was pulled out of the existing tactics for the historical titles. And like I mentioned before, it's a lot clearer now and smaller division of responsibility that the assault tactics create the entry points and the storm entry point tactic uses those entry points. So once we've gotten our units through the entry points and into the settlement, the specific system for the settlement AI takes over, and we can navigate the units to their goals using the settlement graph and its influence maps. So briefly, let's talk about reserves. This is new to Warhammer as well. If a tactic fails or it loses all of its key units, then we can abandon it and send its units elsewhere, which would be to the reserves. It's a pool of units held back to see how the battle unfolds before we decide to commit them, and effectively it becomes a mechanism used to transfer units between tactics. So for example, here you can see that potentially if those two siege towers on the right were destroyed, all of the units within that tactic could be reshuffled. They would go briefly into the reserves before then being assigned to the gate assault tactic. So there's a number of details that we have to consider when stepping through the reserves and making those allocations, but basically we have to pass those assignments up to the detachment for execution after considering the pros and cons of each unit and which entry point it's available to. Like I mentioned before, cavalry units can't use ladders and such, so there's some restrictions there that we have to consider. I'm going to blaze through this section because we're running a bit short on time. So there's a lot of coordination between tactics that we do now in Warhammer. In general, our tactics are designed to be encapsulated and modular. We don't want dependencies between tactics. And we handle that by having the detachment perform the coordination process between the tactics themselves. Instead of a bidding process, which is typical for the rest of the AI, we make specific decisions of this unit should go and do that. So it's more of a direct allocation. So there's a few examples here of tactical coordination, and we'll see those in real time as we get into the video soon. But for example, when the gate assault decides to place ladders, placing ladders is the responsibility of the wall assault tactic, and it wouldn't normally be able to place ladders near a gate because that assault designation for the gate is occupied already by the gate assault tactic. So we have to spawn a new tactic, and that goes through a sequence diagram kind of like this. Hopefully you guys can get a screenshot of that, or the slides are actually publicly available. So if you're really curious, you can go through that in detail after the talk. Second example of coordination is when a tower docks with the walls. So remember that the tactic is complete as soon as the tower docks, and the process of actually ordering the units into the settlement is the responsibility of the storm entry points tactic. So we do a handoff here, similarly between the wall assault tactic through the detachment into the storm entry points tactic. And when we make these assignments, we have to make sure that the units that we're passing off to the storm entry points tactic will use that specific entry point. So they won't dock a tower and then run somewhere else. They'll go up that specific tower. And finally, allocating the reserves. So this is a really important way of coordinating between tactics. Too much to cover in detail here, I'm afraid. We'll take a look at the sequence diagram briefly. So the reserves is periodically looking at the status of all of the entry points on the walls, trying to figure out what should I do with the units that I have available to me. It may choose to assign some of its units to an entry point, or something that we've done a little more recently is we've actually decided that we can start spawning up new tactics from the reserves if we have enough units to justify doing that, and there's assault designations available with good scores. So that actually leads to some really good results, especially with reinforcing armies. Speaking of which, we have to support reinforcements as well, especially AI-controlled reinforcements for a player attacking army. So reinforcements enter the battle after it's begun. That could be either player or AI controlled. And in the case of AI controlled reinforcements, they're not necessarily the same faction as the player. So for example, we could have the dwarves reinforce an empire army against the vampire counts. You can end up with some really spectacular combinations that way. So reinforcements don't bring any siege equipment with them, which is important. So we have to handle that by adding those units into the reserves and relying upon the reserves distribution mechanism for getting them to where they need to be. And if possible, we can also spin up those new tactics from the reserves from that set of reinforcing units. So they're fed into the city using that normal process of allocation of the reserves. So that's enough for the technical details, and I'm sure this is the part that you've all been excited and waiting patiently for. Let's take a look at some of this stuff in action. So the battle that we're about to watch highlights of has an attacking chaos army controlled by the AI against a player-controlled vampire counts army. And everything that you're going to see here was recorded in a custom battle without any DLC, so you can play this day one. So if you take a close look, you'll see that the AI is divided up into groups. We have a wall breach tactic on the left, a gate assault in the center, and a wall assault on the right. And then just around the corner here, we have another wall assault kind of sneaking up the side. So you'll notice that those defensive towers are already firing. And as we get down a bit closer, we can see that they're firing because the vampire counts have assigned some units to occupy the walls nearby. You see that yellow outline? That's a capture point specifically for that one tower. It wouldn't fire if you didn't have a unit standing within that box. So here a tower managed to take out one of the chaos towers, and you'll see the men fleeing from the inside of that tower. Now at this point, that's a group within a wall assault tactic, and that group has failed. So we can take the unit from that group and reassign it to a different group within the same tactic. And then if it cascades from there and the whole tactic fails, then we'll have to reallocate them to the reserves and figure out where else they go. But in this case, we get lucky. The tower is actually docked successfully, and you can see that other unit sneaking up through the back. The Warriors of Chaos here are piling out very quickly, and you'll see that as a sharp contrast to how the ladders work shortly. So they've piled in here against some of the vampire units. You can see them taking advantage of the slightly wider walls, being able to pile in around the back and get a bit of a flanking bonus. Man, these guys look cool. I'm totally playing Chaos when this comes out. All right, here we go with the gate assault tactic led by a giant Chaos Giant and supported by some infantry units. So these guys are advancing in formation, right? They're moving to the staging location for the gate assault. And we'll skip ahead briefly here. Once they reach that gate staging formation, we make that calculation of which unit in the tactic is the most appropriate one to attack the gates. And of course it's the giant, because he's a freaking badass. The infantry unit peels off. You'll notice them going for the walls on the side. They're doing that tactical coordination process of spawning a new wall assault near the gate assault so that they can place and climb the ladders. You'll see that a spellcaster snuck in the back there, and he actually dropped a fire spell on the other side of the walls to whittle down the defenders. And here you see the attackers cresting the walls. You notice the difference, it's not quite as aggressive as those guys piling out of the siege tower. So coming out to the wall breach tactic that was on the far left of the field, here we've got 3 Chaos Hell Cannons. And you may have noticed they were flanked by cavalry, and they have some melee infantry in the front. So they obviously have a nice firing arc, and we can place infantry in the front to protect them while firing over their heads at a single wall target. It takes a little while, so we'll check back in on them in a little moment, but we can also see here that even though the vampire accounts have melee defenders on the wall, they're not able to exchange ranged fire, but they are powering up those towers nearby, allowing them to shoot at the hell cannons. Here we've got the Chaos Giant. It managed to break through the gates. It's about to come in and give these guys a really bad day. Yeah, that's not going to go well for them. You can even see in the distance that there's some heavy cavalry coming in to support that attack. Just laying waste to those poor skeletons. Who cares about skeletons? They're already dead, right? Here comes the cavalry on the charge. Giant having a nice snack. And then some Chaos Spawn decide to come in and exploit that same entry point. So that gate, now that it's been busted down, is an accessible entry point. Any units that are in the reserves can now be allocated to it. We kind of prefer to allocate units that are cavalry, for example, through those types of entry points because they can't exploit the wall assaults. So here, going back to the Hell Cannons, they've managed to take the wall down, create a nice fat breach. So the units that were part of that wall breach tactic, such as the cavalry and its supporting infantry, are now immediately placed into the entry point for that particular tactic. So we took the guys that were supporting the cannons, and they're the first to rush through. They get to experience the reward of the entry point that they helped create. So they come in and engage some of the Grave Guard units here. You can see that the artillery in the back, they're still firing. They've been moved to the reserves tactic at this point, and they're taking pot shots at targets of opportunity. All right, that was pretty sweet. So let's summarize real quick before we all get going here. So the Siege AI in Warhammer is remarkably different than the previous games in the series, and it's due primarily to a different set of design goals. So we started with a set of proven functionality, and we iterated on that gameplay in close collaboration with other teams, such as the design team and the battle team. The breadth of player-facing AI behaviors is driven through a variety of unit types and army compositions brought into the battle, and not within randomization of those behaviors themselves. So for the first time, we're using reserves. We're holding units back instead of committing our entire force at the start of the battle. And also for the first time, the friendly AI is able to follow the player's lead instead of just trying to forge its own path. Thanks everyone for attending. We're hiring for all positions. Please stop by our recruiting booth, and we also have a booth set up here where you can play 2 quest battles for Total War Warhammer. So if you haven't already done that, please go ahead and give it a shot. Thanks everyone.
Well done. That's good. Okay, thanks Andre. That's looking really freaking good, man.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Just a quick heads up that the next developer session starts at 1 p.m. It's going to be a Sunless Sea retrospective. And then later on, the Creative Assembly, being lovely, have sponsored a game jam, which means that a bunch of people at Res to be making games, and there are going to be some awards that are given out at 5 p.m. at the developer sessions room, which is here. So please come to that if you're around. And yeah, once again, one more round of applause for Andre and the AI team. Thank you.
You can see the biggest developers live and play a huge range of unreleased games at each. You can see the biggest developers live and play a huge range of unreleased games at EGX 2016 in Birmingham from the 22nd to the 25th of September. The UK's biggest games event is going even bigger this year, with more space and more screens to make it our best ever. Play this year's hits first, see developers live, and check out the spectacular cosplay stage, gigantic retro selection, plus sessions and talks on getting into the games industry.